Well, hello everyone, and also thank you very much to Katrine and the organisers of this seminar series for the invitation to talk. I hope it will be interesting to you and also a little bit different. So my name's Nick and I'm a postdoc in the Computational Creativity Lab at the VUB. And this talk is going to be about part of my current research interests. And this is really about statistical learning of knowledge from sequential data. And I'm going to try and frame this research in the context of the wider interests of the Computational Creativity Lab. So the outline of my talk will be as follows. First, I'm going to give an introduction to the Computational Creativity Lab. So our philosophy and our specific areas of interest. And then I'm going to talk about my specific areas of interest within that. And then I'm going to give a high-level outline of one specific method that we're developing in the Computational Creativity Lab for statistical modeling of sequence data. And I'll follow that by describing two quite different applications of this method. The first is looking at sequences which describe an agent's behavior in a kind of minimalistic grid world maze. And the second is looking at music sequences, so trying to model the perceptual or cognitive structures in music. And then I'll finish by talking about what we're currently working on in terms of next steps in terms of all this work, and specifically two open challenges which we don't yet have solutions to, which I hope you'll find interesting. So I think this talk should be about 45 minutes, so we can use the remaining time for questions and discussion. And if anyone is working on anything similar or related, it would be great to hear from you. So starting with the introduction. So as I said, I'm in the Computational Creativity Lab. We are currently 4 members. So Professor Geraint Wiggins, who some of you will surely know, is the head of the group. And besides myself, we have Steve Homer. He's a PhD student and he's working on kinds of spectral knowledge representation. So that is it involves a signal processing element and then connecting that with the more kind of knowledge representation, cognitive modeling that we're doing. And then we also have Fernando, who is with us for 3 months, and he's doing some software development for us. So our research broadly comes under the banner of computational creativity. And it's worth just explaining what that is for those who are unfamiliar. So ultimately, we're interested in systems which exhibit creative behavior. And fundamentally, what that means is an approach to AI which goes beyond mere problem solving and more towards a paradigm of problem seeking. So specifically, we're interested in predictive, statistical, unsupervised learning models and the role that they can play in cognitive architectures. So one such cognitive architecture is called IDIOT. It's the Information Dynamics of Thinking, and this is a system of Professor Wiggins. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but I think it's worth mentioning just because it quite well encapsulates many of the things that we're interested in the CC lab. So it's worth looking into if you're interested in this kind of work. So in terms of my specific interests within the group, I tend to summarize them like this. My interests are representation and learning of hierarchical knowledge structures. So this can be broadly broken down into 2 parts. There's the representation part and the learning part. And on the representation side, I'm interested in formal knowledge representation systems. So this involves things like logic, ontology, formal reasoning systems, as well as programming languages and type theory. And on the learning side, I'm interested in statistical predictive models and how they can be used to learn the kind of knowledge that we want to, that I'm doing on the representation side. So learning knowledge from sequential data is a big part of my interests. And it's this learning side which I'm going to be talking about today. So that was a very brief introduction to the CC group. Now I'm going to talk about the core part of this talk is going to be an explanation of this specific method that we have for statistical modeling of sequence data. There are a number of different chunks to the explanation, so I have a slide for each one of those. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail, but I hope to give just enough so that you can really get a sense of the kind of research we're doing, and if there are more in-depth questions, we can talk about that at the end. So the objective of this method is as follows. We want to learn in an unsupervised way statistical patterns from sequential data. And then we want to use those patterns to construct hierarchical knowledge structures that we can reason with. So that's very abstract, and later, of course, I'm going to talk about concrete applications of this. But I think I want to stress here that this idea of going unsupervised from low-level sequence data to high-level knowledge representations is really central to what we're interested in the CC lab. So the method I'm going to describe is based on a system called IDIOM. IDIOM stands for the Information Dynamics of Music, and it was developed by Marcus Pearce, among other people, and it's a system which finds statistical patterns in musical sequences. Essentially what it does is use variable order Markov models on various different aspects of music, so various different dimensions of music. And a large part of the work that I'm currently doing is developing tools which make available aspects of this modeling method to application contexts other than music. So one of which I'm going to talk about later. And I think the reason we're interested in this, so IDIOM, although it was developed, almost 20 years ago now, is still among the best cognitive models of music. So this statistical method really has some power to it. And so we're interested in seeing where else this can apply. And as you might have guessed from the similar acronyms, the IDIOM system is one of the progenitors of the IDIOT cognitive architecture, which I mentioned earlier. So starting at the beginning then, perhaps one of the simplest ways to think about modeling sequences is to use Engrams. So an Engram is just a subsequence of length n, and this diagram here shows such a subsequence. These yellow blobs are the elements of the sequence, and this circled Engram, it's of length 5, and I've called it G. And typically, we also call the first n-1 elements of the sequence the context. So these are these things labeled C here. And that's followed by an element which we call the current element, or the one that when we're doing statistical modeling, this is the one we're trying to assign a probability estimate to. So if you take a collection of examples of sequences and you count all the different types of Engrams you have, you can use these counts to estimate the probability that an Engram will occur in a yet unseen sequence. And this is called the maximum likelihood. And it's simply defined, it's the number of times that a particular Engram has occurred as a proportion of the number of times that that context has occurred, followed by any other symbol. So here on the bottom, we're summing over this T, which is all the elements which have been seen in the examples. So the notation here may be a little bit different to what is commonly used, but I just set it up here to look kind of just like a function of two arguments, where the first argument is the current element and the second argument is the context. So there are two basic problems with this kind of naive approach to estimating probabilities. So the first is how do you select the right value of n for your engrams? So this choice is usually highly dependent on the types of sequence data that you have, and more importantly, the types of patterns that there are in it, or the kinds of patterns you're trying to find. So, and the second problem is how do you estimate the probability of symbols which have not occurred in your example sequences? So this second problem is rather important when we're talking about cognitive models, because in general, in cognitive science or in perceptual models, you don't necessarily want to assign a probability of 0 to something, to a novel element. You know, there's always, it's not necessarily that something novel happens with 0 probability in this cognitive context. So both of these problems are addressed by the PPM algorithm, and PPM stands for prediction by partial match. And what PPM does is essentially combine the probability estimates that arise by looking at all the engrams of length up to a certain order bound. And it also reserves some probability mass for elements which haven't yet been seen. So this diagram is the same sequence, and I've circled these 5 engrams and labeled them G1 to 5. So G1 has a context of length 0, for example, and G5 has a context of length 4. So the details about how PPM blends the predictions is quite involved, and there is an extensive literature on slight modifications to the algorithm and extensions to the algorithm. So I'm not going to go into those details here, but I have put at the bottom of this slide a formula which is a formula for one particular flavor of PPM. So in this formula, these alphas here are kind of like a modified maximum likelihood estimate. So the maximum likelihood from the previous slide. And you compute one of these maximum likelihoods or for each of the engrams up to your order bound. And here, so there's a notation here, C prime 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 means the context with that number of primes elements knocked off the front. So G2 is this E following C prime prime prime. So that's just an explanation of the notation. So also in this formula, we have gamma. So these maximum likelihood estimates are scaled by gamma. So gamma is just a weight assigned to each order of n-gram prediction. So the result is just a weighted combination of these estimates for all the relevant n-grams. Note also that there's this gamma 0 at the end. And this is important because it ensures that the probability estimate is non-zero even when the element E hasn't occurred in any of these contexts. So this is that cognitive idea that novel things shouldn't necessarily have a 0 probability assigned to them. So now that we have a method for estimating the probabilities, we need a way of evaluating these predictive models. And for this, we use information theory. And in particular, we use information content. So information content is defined as the negative log of the probability. But essentially, you can think of information content as quantifying the level of unexpectedness of an element in a given context. So the fewer times an element has occurred in the given context, the lower the probability estimate will be for that n-gram. And the lower the probability estimate, the higher the information content will be, meaning it's more unexpected. So now we can use mean information content over an entire sequence or collection of sequences to quantify how well a predictive model fits the data in some sense. So if every element of a sequence is predicted with high probability, then the mean information content of elements in that sequence will be low. So this means the predictive model fits the data very well. Another important concept from information theory is also entropy. So entropy can be thought of as a measure of uncertainty about what will come next in a given sequence. So specifically, it's the expected information content of the next symbol. And it's defined as the sum over all known elements of the probability, over all known elements of the information content of that symbol multiplied by its probability. So given a sequence where, according to your predictive model, one element is extremely likely to come next and all the others are very unlikely, you have low entropy or low uncertainty. You're very certain about what's going to come next. And on the other hand, if they're all equally likely, then you're uncertain about what's going to come next. So it's important to stress here that entropy is calculated from the probability distributions over next elements at any point in a sequence, whereas information content is calculated for each element as it occurs. So I hope that distinction is clear. These information theoretic ideas have been demonstrated to quite closely capture certain perceptual and cognitive phenomena that govern, grouping of sequences. So they're important for later stages of this method. Another thing we need to consider is that in many practical contexts, elements of sequential data don't just contain a single value, but rather they contain multiple different values, each capturing some different attribute of the element. So to illustrate, I have a diagram here of a simplified musical sequence, and each element has three attributes. It has a pitch, an onset time, and a duration. So music is a good example to use here because in music, the kinds of patterns you might want to find might be either rhythmic patterns or pitch patterns. So they might involve the time or the pitch. And you might not have exact repetitions of pitch and time patterns, but you might have a rhythm repeated but with different pitches, or a melody repeated but with a different rhythm, for example. So in order to deal with these kinds of multidimensional sequences, we need a representational and modeling framework which allows us to address each one of these attributes separately and in different combinations. So for this, we use multiple viewpoint systems. So you can think of a viewpoint as a kind of feature of an element of a sequence or an engram in a sequence. And these features could either be just basic features, they could just project out an attribute of that particular element, or they could be more complex features which involve the relationships between consecutive elements of a sequence. So for example, in this sequence, you might define a viewpoint which gives you the inter-onset interval of these two notes. So, the time that has elapsed between since the last note of each note. So multiple viewpoint systems enable us to construct different predictive models for different dimensions or combinations of dimensions in a sequence, and then combine those predictions into a final prediction of what a certain attribute of the next element will be. Another important thing to point out here is that using mean information content, we can evaluate separately the predictive models for different viewpoints. And one thing that Idiom can do is perform automatic viewpoint selection on a sequence so as to select the best representation, the representation which contains the most information according to the statistical patterns in the data. So one thing which I haven't touched upon yet is how these predictive models are trained. So we have this multiple viewpoint representation, and we can train models on these viewpoints in different combinations. And so there are two different ways in which we can train models. We call these different ways the short-term model and the long-term model. So a short-term model is trained incrementally. So it generates predictions for next elements in a sequence incrementally by stepping through a sequence and then updating the Engram counts according to the data that it has seen in the sequence. By contrast to this, a long-term model is trained just with a whole bunch of example sequences, and you count all the Engrams in them and tally them up. So this distinction here between a short-term model and a long-term model, this really comes from cognitive science, where the roles played by short-term memory and long-term memory are substantially different in different perceptual contexts. So take music, for example. Your expectation of what's going to happen next in a certain musical piece is governed more by what has occurred earlier in that piece than by music you heard 10 years ago, for example. So given your viewpoint representation, you can train these different short-term and long-term models on those viewpoints, and then you can combine those predictions into a long-term prediction and a short-term prediction, and then combine those again to get a final prediction. And this combination of predictions is done again using entropy. So we look at the how certain a prediction was. And so if a certain viewpoint is very certain about what's going to come next, then that gets weighted more than if another predictive model was less certain about what was coming next. So now we have these predictive models, and we want to use them now to find statistical patterns. We want to find patterns and then do this construction, hierarchical construction of knowledge. So the first step towards this is segmentation of the sequences. And again, to do this, we use information. We use information content and entropy. So this plot here shows the information content in blue and the entropy in orange of a short sequence. And so the predictive models gives us values for each of these throughout the sequence. And you can see that these information profiles have certain features in them. So there's a big spike here, for example, and then some smaller spikes here. And so we want to try and use these features to segment the sequence. And so the basic assumption behind this approach is as follows. If you have a cognitively salient pattern in your sequence that you've encountered many times before, when you reach the beginning of that sequence, you might be unsure about what's coming next. But as that subsequence progresses, you slowly become more and more certain that you're seeing an instance of this subsequence. And by the time you get to the end, you're very sure. So an example of this is a sentence. So when you hear a sentence, at the beginning of the sentence, you might not know where it's going. But as you get further and further through the sentence, you become more sure, up until the point where, you know, the last word or last couple of words, you could probably fill in, you could probably finish the sentence for that person. So that's what we want to do in terms of segmentation. And it's important to note that this would just be the first step in what we're ultimately interested in for this method, which is that ultimately what we'd like to be able to do is take these segments and somehow abstract them and classify them. And then they themselves become sequence elements in a higher level sequence. So a sequence of sequences, if you will. And then we can apply the same predictive modeling methods to this higher level sequence, and so on into as many levels as might be required. And so the aim of this is to move towards higher levels of prediction and more abstract representations of sequences. So that was a very brief overview of the method. I'm now going to talk about these concrete applications, starting with the one on agent behavior. So this is work we're doing in collaboration with some colleagues who are interested in reinforcement learning. And the basic problem is that some reinforcement learning problems suffer from sparse reward signals. So this might be that the reinforcement learning agent who's trying to achieve a certain goal, the overall goal might be obscured by certain intermediate obstacles. And these situations can be helped by explicitly incorporating subtask knowledge into the learning algorithm. So that this subtask knowledge might be able to inform the policy that the agent is taking. So they start performing a subtask rather than just trying to reach the goal, the overall goal. So what we want to do is see if we can learn in an unsupervised way from human demonstrations subtask knowledge that could be used by agents to solve related problems. So far we've considered a very simple scenario. This is a kind of a reinforcement learning agent in a maze, in a kind of grid world maze. And this is a very simple scenario whereby the agent must unlock a door. So the red blob here is the agent, and then this slightly darker red blob is a key, and then this thing in the green wall here is the door. So in this simple scenario, there's one main task, which is to open the door, and then there are two subtasks. There's pick up the key, and then there's unlock the door. So we have a data set of 1,000 human demonstrations of this simple task. And they each start from a random configuration of agent, key, and door. And this is one of those sequences. So this sequence is read from top left to bottom right. And here in the red square is the boundary state, as it were, between the two subtasks. So at this point, the agent has just picked up the key, and now it's moving on to the next subtask, which is open the door. So in this simple scenario, we've got one task, two subtasks, and we want to try and learn from human demonstrations. Can we identify this subtask boundary? So before we can apply our predictive modeling method, we need a viewpoint representation of the grid world states. And so these diagrams illustrate some of the viewpoints which we've defined. So for example, the diagram on the left illustrates how we represent the location of objects, or one of the ways we represent them. So the grid is divided into quadrants, and then you have a feature which says, you know, in which quadrant is the key, for example, which would be 3. So these can be thought of as kind of bird's eye viewpoints. They just completely unbiased represent the locations of things in the grid. On the other hand, we also have more first person viewpoints. So like this middle diagram here, we explicitly represent what object, if any, is in all of the squares surrounding the agent. And so this is a first person viewpoint because it changes as the agent moves around. So it's sort of in relation to the agent. And we represent other things like the distance that the agent is from the far wall and that kind of stuff. And also we explicitly represent the last action that has been taken by the agent in this example sequence. The actions are sort of written along the side here. So each action then results in the next state. So these actions are kind of like previous actions. So armed with this viewpoint representation of the grid world, we can apply our predictive modeling method to the data set, and we can produce the same kinds of information profile plots that I showed before. So this is an example of one of those plots. Again, information content is in blue and entropy is in orange. And there's also information gain here, but I'm not going to talk about that. And the x-axis is labeled with the previous actions, just so you can sort of track, what's going on in the mission. And this red line here indicates the place that we're trying to find. This is the subtask boundary, the point where the agent has picked up the key and now it has to open the door. And these red crosses mark certain points where there are certain features of the information profiles. So for example, minimum information content, and then maximum difference in entropy. So that's kind of like a derivative feature. So we explored a wide variety of different models and different segmentation methods, and our results were fairly good. So using naive assumptions, we were able to accurately identify about 90%, 97% of these subtask boundaries. But we also discovered some other interesting things. So when we allow Idiom to do an automatic viewpoint selection, we ask it to select the best viewpoints for this data set, it invariably favors the first person viewpoints. And I think that makes quite a lot of intuitive sense. There is more information, there is a greater level of pattern in the first person viewpoints than in the bird's eye viewpoints. We also discovered that bigram models perform best, so just considering one context element. And also that mean information content. So if you select the viewpoint models or an overall model based on purely on information content, it doesn't necessarily give you the best information profiles for segmenting. So in terms of what we want to do next with this grid world stuff, this was a very simplistic first example, but a good first approach of applying this method. So in terms of our next steps, we have three things we want to do really. We definitely want to start looking at more complex problems. So that might be a task which has 3 subtasks, for example. This will involve a more general representation of the grid world. So we need to think about what viewpoints we use more carefully and make them more general. In general, these grid world problems can have any number of doors, keys, objects, and so we need to make a representation which accommodates that. And we also want to perform more generalized segmentation and classification of segments. So up to this point, we've just been trying to see a feature in the information profiles and see if it corresponds to the boundary. But what we want to do now is just have an agnostic segmentation approach and then have a careful look at what segments come out of that. What is the agent doing in these various segments? And I'll talk about all of those things again at the end of my talk. So now moving on to the second application. This is the music application, and this is a little bit different to the previous application. So rather than learn knowledge which can be directly applied in some other problem, what we want to do here is see if we can learn in an unsupervised way the more perceptual or cognitive representations of musical structure. So I think this distinction is important, and it's important to emphasize that music, it's obviously extremely interesting and challenging from the perspective of computational creativity. So not only is it fundamentally a creative domain, but it also offers a kind of window onto the mind. So by applying our statistical predictive modeling methods to music sequences, we might hope that we can gain some insight into the cognitive mechanisms which govern things like perceptual grouping and chunking more generally. So this is some work which is in its very early stages. We have a corpus of 1,000 simple folk melodies. This is one of them, and they all have a very similar kind of structure and a very conventional musical form. And these melodies are also annotated with phrase boundaries, and these are the things which I've put as green lines here. So these phrase boundaries are kind of musicological analyses of these folk tunes. So what we'd like to be able to do is obviously apply our modeling method, do some segmentation, and see how that segmentation really relates to this kind of very basic musicological segmentation. So again, before we can do this, we need a representation for musical sequences. So luckily, this is already provided us by idiom because it was originally devised for music. So the idiom system defines a huge number of musical viewpoints. And I'm not going to go into the details of how those are done, but it's an extremely rich representation. The basic idea is that sort of atomic viewpoints capture the basic attributes of notes. So, like my example of the musical sequence from earlier, you have attributes such as pitch, onset time, duration, these kinds of things. And then you have more complex viewpoints, which capture more sophisticated musicological relationships between consecutive notes. So you might have things like inter-onset interval, like I said, or pitch contour or pitch interval. So these kind of derived viewpoints, which can also be used in predictive models. So this is a very sophisticated representation that idiom provides for us. And so then we can apply this statistical modeling method. And here is another plot of the information profiles. And this is for the folk tune that I showed on the previous slide. And again, the green lines indicate the annotated phrase boundaries that were the same as those boundaries on the previous diagram. And then we perform segmentation on this melody. And we do this, in this case, we did it by simply picking peaks in the information content. And so these red crosses represent the segments that drop out when you just use a certain threshold on these information content peaks. And as you can see, it's not perfect. Some of these phrase boundaries are captured by these peaks in information content, and some of them are very close. And there are other ones which don't seem to correspond with phrase boundaries at all. But the most interesting thing to notice about this plot is just how much variation there is in the information profiles. So there are a lot of peaks of different heights, and even this kind of flat peak here, which seems interesting. And so, okay, it's this complexity in these information profiles, which leads me on to what we want to do next with this work.
I'm sorry, Nick, can I interrupt you with a question?
Yes, of course, of course.
Yeah. If you go back to the previous slide, it's a bit surprising to me to see that the information content is high at the end of the phrases. I would think that you can predict what's going to come at the end of a sentence, as you explained. So in music, it's the same.
Yeah. Okay. So there might be a slight issue with the resolution on this. So it's not, so where the phrase boundaries are actually plotted, it's kind of at the location of the note rather than in between the notes. So if I understand correct, so yeah. So when you see a peak here, for example, this high value of information content here really corresponds to the first note of a phrase.
Yeah.
So when you reach, so this low one here would be the very end of the phrase.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
So yeah. So we're observing that sort of complexity, all those peaks and stuff in those information profiles. What we would really like to do now, so there has already been a substantial amount of work. The early idiom work has explored different kinds of models and different kinds of segmentation techniques to try and evaluate and evaluating them against these kinds of musicological annotations. But what we want to look at now is we want to do a more generalized segmentation. So we want to look at, what would happen if you segment using more of these peaks? What if you try and look at very small, fine-grained segments of this music? And then what we want to do is look at what kinds of segments result from these low-level features, and in general try and classify them. And ultimately, of course, as I've mentioned, is that we want to abstract those segments and make them elements in a higher level sequence. And then we want to reapply this predictive modeling technique to those abstracted subsequences. So then what you might hope is that the resulting higher level information profiles give you a better way to segment, or at least a segmentation which more closely or more obviously reflects the higher level structure. So really the goal here is to work towards this layered predictive modeling approach, whereby we would hope that these kind of higher level musicological or cognitive structures actually result from these intermediate level, low level, maybe perceptual chunks. So that's really the goal with this musical work. So that's everything I have to say about these applications, and I just want to finish by kind of summarizing the future work and talking about these open challenges. So here is a summary of future work, very small. Now all these are things which I've alluded to already. Sorry, just move that down. But I want to summarize clearly now and kind of draw it all together. So in terms of immediate next steps, as I say, I'm working on developing tools which make it possible to apply different aspects of this method to different kinds of data. So tools for designing viewpoint representations and constructing different statistical models. So the original idiom system was built in Lisp. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. And so a lot of the work that I did on this grid world stuff had to be done by modifying the Lisp code to accommodate non-musical data, and that's a lot of effort. So by having more generalized and composable tools, we hope that we can sort of open up the possibilities for experimentation with this method. And in particular, I want to integrate this learning work, this sequential learning work, with the knowledge representation stuff I'm doing. So I haven't talked about that today, but all this is really aimed ultimately at having an environment in which we can apply this method in layers and doing higher level prediction and abstracting segments in a kind of principled way. And we have tools for playing with that. So this brings me to the open challenges. I've got two here. The first is, how do we generalize viewpoint representations? So this is of course quite application specific, but what I mean is, how do we develop viewpoint representations for a domain so as to be complete but also unbiased? And so you want it to be complete and then leave it to the multiple viewpoint system to select the best representational features for a given scenario. So if you take the example of the grid world, what we want is a representation which captures any kind of maze, but which is agnostic to the actual goal of the maze. And then we use this representation to represent human demonstrations and let the system identify which are the most relevant representational features for solving that problem. One of the things we're working on here is a more generalized algebra of viewpoints so that the system can do more intelligent things by combining them and deriving new ones and so on. But this is still a very embryonic idea at the moment. So the second open challenge is about segment classification. So I've already mentioned this several times, but kind of sum it up here. So the idea is, like, when should two segments be considered equal? So this is, again, highly application specific, but if you take the grid world, for example, we would like to be able to classify or abstract segments in such a way that, you know, one instance of picking up a key is in some sense equal to another instance of picking up a key, irrespective of the absolute coordinates of the agent and the key and the path taken to pick it up and so on. So there are many ways to think about this, and even more ways to think about this in the context of music. So similarity and equality of musical sequences are themselves huge areas of interest. So we would like to start incorporating some of these ideas into the tools that we're building for statistical modeling, and really work towards a generalized environment for learning, reasoning, and knowledge representation in general. So that's everything I've prepared to say. These are the references for my slides. Actually, I think these will be made available online, if I'm not mistaken. And so it just remains for me to say thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions or things they'd like to raise, I'd be really interested to discuss more.